Well, to Australia now, where the world's top tennis player will not be defending his Australian Open title. Novak Djokovic has been deported after losing an appeal to stay in Australia and compete. Now, the tennis star did appeal to stay in the country despite having his visa revoked over his COVID vaccination status. In a statement, Djokovic says he is extremely disappointed with the court ruling, but the decision is being met with mixed reaction in both Australia and in Serbia.
It's his decision. So I think he hasn't done anything wrong.
I'm really sorry that he's not playing Australian Open and that he didn't get a chance to play. But I get all the COVID situation that's happening down there in Australia.
I have a 12-year-old, I have a niece and nephew that play elite tennis that have been able to play at all throughout this whole pandemic, and to get back to playing had to have their double vaccination to be even being allowed to train. Fair's fair.
Not to get political, but I'd just like to say, Novak, you've won the fight, but looks like you lost the political war.
Well, for more, we're now reaching out to Jane McManus. She is the director of Maris Center for Sports Communication, also a sports columnist for Deadspin. Jane, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So listen, as one who watches obviously the sport very closely, what's your reaction to this deportation of Novak Djokovic?
Well, I think what's going on here is really that there are two things involved, and one is, of course, tennis and the sport of tennis and being able to play a tournament abroad, and the other is public health problem and an international virus that is causing all sorts of changes when it comes to rules on immigration and who can get into different countries and how easily, et cetera. And Australia made the decision that people have to be double vaccinated to come in, with few exceptions, and that Novak Djokovic's decision not to become vaccinated was problematic. And I think obviously this is a harbinger of things to come. I think we're going to see with different Olympic events in the future. I don't see this becoming less restrictive at any point, and I think athletes are going to have a tough decision to make. And Djokovic is ultimately deciding between his career right now and becoming vaccinated.
Now, Canadian tennis player Vasek Pospisil, he's calling out the ATP right now, saying, quote, they've already shown repeatedly that they do not care about the players. Now they're showing, says Pospisil, that a complete lack of leadership when faced with real issues. When you look at that, could the ATP have played a bigger role here? Have they actually failed players by not, for example, standing up or negotiating for a player like Djokovic?
Well, I don't know necessarily what the ATP can do when it comes to international borders and immigration policy. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think we could all say that there are certain things about international travel that we don't find reasonable. For example, here in the United States, when we have to take off our shoes before boarding a plane for an incident that happened 20 years ago, and that not being necessarily a huge problem when it comes to international air travel today, but we still have to do it. And so even if rules don't seem reasonable, really, the negotiation, there's not a negotiation between the ATP and Australia. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty strong basis for asking for an exception for your particular players. And necessarily, I think, Australia and all of the other countries that host these international tournaments are going to have to decide if a tennis match, if a tennis tournament, if international play has enough of a, benefit to the country to be able to waive certain public health guidelines that it's put in place.
Now, interestingly, the Australian Open did extend the invitation to Djokovic, and I do wonder now about the impact this will actually have on his career, because he could, invitation or not, when he's initially denied by Australian border authorities, he could have just turned around and gone back home. Instead, he decided to fight it, and making very public his stance on vaccines for him. What impact do you think that will actually have on his career?
Well, it has a huge impact on his career. Right now, he has 20 Grand Slam singles titles. So does Rafael Nadal, and so does Roger Federer. And the three of those are really, tied for, to decide who was the greatest of this era. And I think everybody kind of has their favorite, but Djokovic was really in a position, given that he's still healthy, he's still playing well on multiple surfaces, to be able to say that he was ultimately the best, that he had the staying power, that he had the game that lasted. And now that's in question, because it's not just going to be the Australian Open now. I mean, you have a situation coming up with the French Open where when Djokovic had a positive PCR test, one of the things that he did knowingly was to sit down with L'Equipe, and a reporter and a photographer took off his mask and didn't tell them that he was COVID positive. And that's a French publication. And so I think you're going to have this, particularly an issue in France, where they're very keenly aware of the violation of rules and whether or not you extend an exception to someone in that case. So I think going forward, you have an international tour, and yet the reason that you can play on an international tour is because things are easy and movement is easy between countries, and that's just not something that we have right now. And so to enhance that difficulty by not getting vaccination, I think really does, it does make it so that every single time he plays a tournament, there has to be an exception made to let him in. And how is that going to look in terms of a career? It really does make it very difficult, I think, to focus on a career when every single time you want to play a tournament abroad, you're going to have these questions come around. And I just think, I think ultimately Djokovic has to make a decision here. Is he going to be, putting his energy and his efforts into, becoming the best man of his generation to play tennis? Or is he, going to take a stand for people who don't want to get vaccinated and have a showdown at every tournament? And those are two different things. And I think he has to decide what his goal is with this.
Jane McManus, appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
Happy to be here.